Okay, I'll just go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindokuhle Gama. I am a philosopher from Rhodes University at the Department of Philosophy. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizing committee and the cohorts of the League of African Women Philosophers for putting together what really is a historically important organization of women, and really giving us the platform where would otherwise perhaps not be heard and also become part of the furniture. So I'd like to commend all of you, especially Dr. Vasidi, for this platform. So, my presentation today is focused on my paper titled Misogynoir in African Philosophy, Resistance and Possibilities. In the main, I ally myself with African feminist discourses that contend that there is a conspicuous absence of African women, both in the canon and the composition of African philosophy. And here I'm focusing mostly on the Anglophonic divide. I contend that the absence of these issues in the canon and the devalued depiction of the African woman in the discipline is indicative of an oppressive regulative order functioning within the discipline as misogynoir. Herein, I take misogynoir to be the systems, processes, and practices that maintain the moral devaluation and absence of African women in discourses. It is a regulatory order whose overall function is to police and enforce this overarching ideology, namely what I term racial heteropatriarchy. And here I take my cue from thinkers such as Sylvia Wynter and Maria Lugones. Rather than challenging this oppressive order, there is a low engagement with gender-related violence and discrimination directed to African women in African philosophy. So in this paper, I argue that there is an antagonism to trying to ameliorate the state of affairs. An antagonism I take to be a kind of resistance to changing the state of affairs in African philosophy. Specifically, I examine two key forms of resistance: the indifference of African male philosophers who are racialized Black, and the co-option and erasure of African women by white women philosophers who treat African women's lived experiences as merely anthropological work to be excavated. By interrogating these forms of resistance, I aim to shed light on the mechanisms that maintain misogynoir, which is the entanglement of a kind of anti-Black racist and heteropatriarchal order within African philosophy, and further consider how we might begin to dismantle it. The exclusion of African women, my problem statement that I work with here is that the exclusion of African women from philosophical discourse is not a mere oversight. It is a systemic issue. African philosophy, despite addressing coloniality and racism, fails to challenge the racialized heteropatriarchal order that marginalizes African women. This erasure perpetuates epistemic violence and devalues African women's personhood as well as lived experiences. So I argue that amongst many structural impediments to ameliorating the exclusion of African women, the antagonism to their inclusion and challenges to their moral devaluation is slowing the process of mainstreaming gender. Herein, I identify two forms of resistance, as I've pointed out, wherein male philosophers focus on racial oppression while ignoring gendered violence. This creates a framework where male experiences are treated as representative of the entire community, and this also includes heterosexual experiences as well. And secondly, the co-option by white women philosophers, wherein white women often speak on behalf of African women, extracting their experiences while excluding them from the discourse. I must say that I work mostly with the South African context, but I do think there are similarities across the African context, which this kind of critique can also apply. But I don't want to be accused of making essentialisms about kinds of relations that I'm not really exposed to, but I have a sneaking suspicion, especially given something like this platform existing, that our experiences are not too dissimilar as African women in philosophy. So I argue that so let us begin rather with what I believe is the purpose of African philosophy. As Kwame Cheche argued, philosophy must engage with the material realities of our communities in order to be socially responsible, or at least produce socially responsible work. The fundamental socio-political value of philosophy, then, is to offer insights on the fundamental ideas that underlie social pathologies. It can offer practical guidance and provide people with rules with which to live by and how to structure their institutions. In this way, they also provide people with fundamental belief systems. So, as Priscilla Abosede Ibadiola argues, I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong, whatever happens in academia invariably affects what happens in larger society. This, she argues, is evident throughout the history of human existence, illustrated by the fluidity of knowledge as it moves between the academy and society. This is no less true of the corpus of academic African philosophy that has aided the development of African society. It is uncontroversial to claim that contemporary African philosophy, especially of the Anglophonic variety, comes to be as a challenge to an alienating canon, being Western philosophy. This articulation was also a way of reclaiming a lost humanity that was otherwise denigrated as a result of colonial and apartheid thinking. However, despite these decolonial aspirations, I argue that the discipline of African philosophy has largely failed to engage meaningfully with gendered issues. Since it began as an academic discipline, feminine and oppressive subjects related to the unique positionality of African women has been absent from the canon. Where there is engagement with issues related to femininity and women in African philosophy, they are depicted as the inferior gender, unequal to men, infantilized, invisible, or written out of anti-colonial nationalist ideologies. While they, meaning African philosophers, address racial neutrality or racism in the colonial era, they allied in gender dynamics which are part and parcel of coloniality or the modern colonial system. That is, that the theories only challenge the racial neutrality of Western moral discourses and ignore the gender dynamics imbricated in that construction. In so doing, they do not fully capture African women in the theories. Rather, they capture the experience of the dominant members of the group as those taken to be male and heterosexual. In a world that treats those who do not belong discriminatorily and violently, how can we continue to justify not capturing certain experiences and issues in the discipline? Moreover, how can we begin to understand and fight the gender discrimination and gendered violence on our doorstep with a theory that only accounts for and defends the privileged constituents of our communities and ignores half of the population? Sophie Olawale asserted that while there is now a dearth of African feminist scholarship in socio-historical disciplines, there's almost nothing when it comes to academic African philosophy. The gender composition of African philosophy remains male. Here, Thaddeus Metz asserts that Black female African philosophers are still especially rare, whether they work on feminism or not. Indeed, in his own words, extraordinarily few African women practice professional philosophy, and there's little interest in feminism among the men who principally do. Agreeing, Louise Dutoit concurs by writing that there is virtually no feminist writing in the African philosophy traditions. The important point that both these thinkers make, in my opinion, and which Olawale reiterates above, is the decided lack of professional feminist philosophy from Africa. And where there is even an attempt to include these issues, they're written off as petty considerations. That women are marginalized in philosophy is no longer a controversial claim to make. Thinkers bemoan the deliberate and persistent drive to keep philosophers out of the discipline, especially African and those who are gendered women. This exclusion is noted by Leslie Lagrange as operating from, first, a curriculum design aspect, and second, a representation issue. Where it concerns representation, according to Bernard Martolino, in the traditional articulation of African philosophy and in the modernized, professionalized practice of this art in universities, women have been kept at the margins. When it comes to African philosophy, he maintains that it was African males who stood up to register the existence of African philosophy and counter their white counterparts' racist attitudes, but they failed to account for the ways that African women contributed to this endeavor. I think that the resistance of African men to include these issues is best encapsulated by Patricia Hill Collins's quote, wherein she states that to talk of white racist constructions of Black women's sexuality is acceptable, but developing analysis of sexuality that implicate Black men is not. It violates norms of racial solidarity that counsel Black women always to put our own needs second. Even within these racial boundaries, some topics are more acceptable than others. White men's rape of Black women during slavery can be discussed, whereas Black men's rape of Black women today cannot. And the same is true of white men's rape of Black men. Rape, incest, misogyny, Black cultural practices, and other painful topics that might implicate Black men remain taboo in terms of interracial relations. We need not only turn to the cardinal branches of African philosophy to illustrate the masculine codification of the discipline even further. In the field of ethnophilosophy, African women are depicted as vile and inferior, as influenced by sayings, proverbs, stories, and kind of folklores, reflecting African communities' practices, norms, and values. In terms of philosophical sagacity, they take it that men are inherently superior to women, further entrenching the notion that women are not knowledge producers. And the question of nationalist discourses has been labored fundamentally by African feminist thinkers. I need not go through that as well. And finally, we see a great deal of imbalance in gender composition in contemporary African philosophy. While other fields in the social sciences have concerned themselves with gender, it seems to have not found the same kind of soft landing in African philosophy. What the depiction of women in these trends tells us is that there is an overrepresentation of African men and masculinity and heterosexuality in the conception of African ideas and concepts, which excludes the African woman subject and femininity, as well as all other kinds of queer configurations. This bolsters the devaluation of African women as it does not challenge it, it renders it invisible. Therein, African men's interests become synonymous with the interests of African people, such that evoking African men's experiences and interests is synonymous with the interests of the community or political causes. The flip side of that coin is that it maintains oppositional logic from Kantian ontology or the terror of the Cartesian split. And this maintains the Eurocentric logic that dehumanizes non-white people, even though the claim is that these thinkers have set out to challenge these kinds of thinking. Um, Dimpa Maponya asserts that the horizon of African philosophy makes it rather difficult to speak on the marginalization of African women. She finds that if we consider the strides that African philosophers have made when it comes to resisting the racist perception of the African continent, she feels often the sentiment is that African women are being utterly ungrateful towards their stalwarts. And I take these anxieties to go hand in hand with an extreme Afrocentric posturing that rears its head in the name of solidarity when matters of gendered violence and exclusionary hierarchies within African cultures are raised by African women. This kind of cultural nationalism, to echo Amina Mama, creates the perception that the African past is unitary and utopian, leaving us unable to discuss both past and present forms of domination, exploitation, hierarchies of class and ethnicities, as well as gender ideologies. As such, articulating one's social condition as an African woman from this theoretical standpoint is read as a kind of cultural betrayal. And given that race only visibilizes one kind of social ontology, it follows that any appraisal of anti-racist critique as exclusionary seems like a challenge to that social group. But as is the case with any kind of discourse, all discourses have empowering dimensions while simultaneously hindering self-realization. It seems to me that there is a resistance to trying to ameliorate that problem, the latter part of a empowering discourse, that it can also simultaneously hinder self-realization. So while it may empower and value African men's kinds of personhood, it has a tendency to hinder the self-realization of African women's personhood. In terms of white women's resistance to trying to ameliorate the misogynoir that African women experience through their silencing exclusion from the canon, there's a continued tendency of white women to speak on matters concerning African women in ways that treat them as raw material to extract from, while silencing them in African philosophy. Elizabeth Spellman asserts that it is typical of a kind of self-centeredness exhibited by white women, wherein they enjoy being in the saddle of compassion, but may have disincentives to cancel the suffering that provides that ride. My claim here is that white women feminists do not recognize their own privilege in their musings about the moral worth of African women in society, despite claims that they're doing everything to the contrary. I argue if African women cannot speak or speak ineffectively, to evoke Gayatri Spivak here, it is in part because white women have elected themselves to be proverbial spokespersons who articulate the goals, hopes, and dreams of an excluded group. Very rarely do white women philosophers, especially in the South African context, ask themselves if it is morally appropriate to host conferences and write articles about African women, yet constantly exclude them from these activities. It is not uncommon to find, for example, a conference that's happening around the experiences of women in philosophy and find a panel that is not comprised of African women at all and entirely of those of European descent, despite claims of understanding the positionality of African women. Overall, it seems to me that their reflections never amount to anything more than lip service to dismantling racialized heteropatriarchy and self-referential disclosing of their subtle benefits, which accrue from their privilege and struggling to denounce them. In the end, we're not led to any kind of substantive political action that seeks to eradicate these kind of asymmetrical power relations. But African women are used then as a means to an end, where that end is patterned to appear progressive in the academic arena. African women scholars in academia note that when they do attempt to articulate the absence of their voices within the text, their general absence in the institution, or call upon scholars to directly engage with the social condition, one finds that white women co-opt the discourse, thereby exacerbating the very social pathology African women identify. I take the article written by Louise Dutoit to be typical of this kind of co-option. In her article, Old Wives' Tales and Philosophies, Delusions on the Problem of Women in African philosophy, she takes on an argument that's been explained by many different kinds of African women about the nature of African philosophy being too abstract and being too universal in a way that does not capture their experiences. And she takes on this argument to say, well, it's not just philosophy proper that has this problem, but African philosophy itself, and argues that it's not so much that African philosophy rejects women, rather that it rejects a particular mode of writing, and that African women opt more so for literature and creative writing. And so in the end, this is an epistemic preference, the lack of African women in African philosophy, that she reads as a kind of epistemic resistance, but does not take the argument to its logical conclusion, in my opinion. So I think the crisis I find in Dutoit's postulation is that she reads the state of affairs as a matter of preference. It is as though philosophy is this way naturally, and not a reflection of contingent turns in history and attitudes of its practitioners. Are we to understand these women scholars, those she say take up literature and creative writing, to not be interested in abstract metaphysical considerations? One wonders why there's no reflection on the structure and culture of academic philosophy as it finds itself in African institutions. I argue that implicit in the argument is the claim that African women intellectuals have less of a preference, right, and not something that's accounted for by the historical conditions of Africa that led to the foreclosure of African women's contributions. Dutoit seems to engage with epistemic resistance where it concerns African women in a manner that brackets historical contingencies. Perplexingly, I find that she makes note of the historical conditions that have led academic philosophy to look the way that it does in terms of demographics and representation, but proceeds to suggest that this context is not a source of the problem. And in some way, looking towards that context is denying African women of their agency. After all, we've always been doing philosophy, right? But there's something rather sneaky about that argument. It is these very historical constraints that continue to make academic philosophy inhospitable to racialized gendered bodies. Suggesting an alternative reading on the matter, right, and completely jettisoning any kind of reading makes it seem as though institutionalized philosophy is not exclusionary, effectively removing culpability from majority voices within the discipline who do not wish to change the state of affairs. They do not wish to change the state of affairs as it largely benefits them and indemnifies them from the academic exclusion of African women. Overall, there have been many texts outlining the reality that philosophy in general actively denies women access to knowledge production and engagement in the field. And it has been termed blatantly a kind of misogyny hidden in plain sight. So one wonders why it is a matter of misogyny when it is white women who are being excluded on the basis of their gender, but we cannot extend the same logic to the exclusion of African women from the discipline. Seemingly, when African women are excluded, it's a matter of epistemic resistance. It is not the same kind of misogyny at play. Where such exclusion is performed by white men and white women as well, to some extent, black men. So to invoke Sojourner Truth here, aren't African women too? Um, Finally, then, the exclusion of African women from philosophy has profound consequences. It limits the discipline's ability to address intersectional issues and make them visible, thereby perpetuating gender-based injustices in society. Without confronting misogynoir, I argue that African philosophy risks becoming irrelevant to the lived realities of half of its population. In conclusion, addressing misogynoir is not just an ethical imperative, it is essential for the relevance of African philosophy today. By confronting the indifference and co-option, we can create a discipline that truly reflects the interrelatedness at its core. Let us work collectively then, as other African feminists have pointed out, to mainstream African women's experiences and dismantle the systems that silence them. But this is not wholly the responsibility of African women. Addressing misogyny within African philosophy requires confronting both of these forms of resistance I've outlined head on. For African male philosophers, this means acknowledging the gender dimensions of oppression and recognizing their own complicity in sustaining patriarchal structures. And for white women, it means stepping back from their self-appointed roles as spokespersons for African women and creating spaces for those women to articulate their own experiences and laying a path for substantive change in terms of the power dynamics of the discipline. But even as I suggest that we opt for an African feminist framework, as other scholars have pointed out, I also caution against an adoption of this framework, again, to echo the sentiment that even though a particular theory may be empowering in some respects, it can be disempowering in very important respects as well. So as we co-opt, not co-opt, rather, as we adopt African feminism as a framework to attempt to improve and make more visible the experiences of African women, we should also be alert to the ways that these very African feminist frameworks also have the ability to silence African women's experiences on the basis of some of these cultural utopian ideals as well. Thank you very much.